I think punk came out of this strange culture of Britain that had been repressed through the Victorian times. I mean, before Victorian times, we're talking about a very different English culture, where we had good cooking, we had lots of things that we weren't allowed in the Victorian times, and we created an empire in the 19th century, and we fought a First World War for that empire, and by the Second World War, it was no longer a reality at the end of the Second World War, but kids were still taught in England to think that they were the chosen race, the sons of empire, but the reality was, at the end of the 70s, a lot of kids were being taught all this stuff, but when they left school, there was nothing for them, you know. So I think the Pistols really, the power of the Pistols came from their own experience. So, and the rest of punk was other kids of the same kind of age, feeling the same kind of things. Oh, it was a very extreme scene in a class sense as well. You know, the Pistols were something new. There was something feral and like an urban fox about these people. It wasn't your kind of two up, two down, working class, normal families, most of it. It was over the edge of the precipice in social terms. They were actually giving a voice to an area of the working class that was almost beyond the pale. You know, the Beatles were safe working class compared with them, and there was this element of living on the street and surviving incredible hardship. It was a world completely, you know, outside my real experience. I had actually grown up on a council estate, although I went to Cambridge, and my father was a political character who'd been to Oxford and stuff. So it was a kind of thing, you live in a council estate because it's politically the right thing to do. So that was weird. But you know, I'd lived in that world. But these guys were, you know, on the edge of that world, beyond the edge. There was a kind of sub-criminal element almost. Certainly Steve, you know, had this extraordinary existence previously, sleeping in cars because he had nowhere to live, and sleeping on the floor of hookers' rooms in Soho. You know, something very Dickensian and deeply London about the way they knew the streets and the alleyways and things that was just fantastically exotic in a weird way. You know, it's beautiful to see London in that way.
So they were an obvious subject to film, weren't they?
Oh yeah, they were, you know, dying, crying out. You know, from a filmmaker's point of view, it was like, stop whatever else you're doing, you know, just slap yourself around the face and get in there and try and film it. It was a scene that didn't want to be filmed, certainly not by a kind of film school student like me. You know, it wasn't easy to get in there, and it was easier if you were a Rasta DJ, I would think, to wave your camera around to a middle-class arsehole coming in. But that made it even more exciting, you know, that it was hard, it was scary, psychologically, physically. It was really great to force yourself to say, look, just film it, it's fucking amazing, do it.
I mean, how did you first get involved with them?
Well, I had a bizarre meeting with them before they played a gig. I just happened, at the time, you know, you had these wonderful docks in London that were still there, that had been closed down, so they were like a ghost town. Especially on a Sunday, it was completely deserted and had a really eerie but really evocative, rich kind of history in the air to this place. And we used to go down there on Sunday afternoons, just hang out, wander around down there, take photographs and stuff. And I just happened one afternoon to hear this song, you know, kind of wafted on the breeze, and newspapers were blowing around in the wind. It was a very nice feeling in the air. And I heard this strange song coming in wafts of, from the 60s, a Small Faces song. And I was actually at the film school at the time. I was trying to do a little piece about 60s kids in London in the 60s. So that music was kind of interesting because you didn't hear it that often. And it was a bit like a Alice in Wonderland moment. And it's my own personal mythology. You know, it's kind of weird whether it was hard to believe it was true, but it was true, you know, that I followed this sound, and I came to just one of these warehouses. The door was open, this old rotting warehouse in Rotherhithe, and went up the stairs. The music was getting louder and more intense, and it was raw, and it was weird that they were singing "I want you to know that I hate you" rather than "love you." That just was unthinkable at the time. This was desecration. And it was this wonderful open plan thing where your head just came up out of the stairwell and saw this vision of this band, and it was kind of humorous on one level because they looked like bumblebee figures, you know, with big fat shoes and kind of mohair Michelin men, fat bodies with big mohair jumpers with stripes and things. But the attitude and the look, and just in 1 second you just knew you'd seen something you'd never seen before, and you know, I did get this feeling that this is it. It's like finding the Holy Grail or something in a moment, which is bizarre because it was just the band on a Sunday afternoon rehearsing. I asked them if they'd do a piece for this film, and they weren't interested in that, but they did say they were doing a gig. And I didn't see the gig at St Martin's, but I went to the one at Central, where there was hardly anyone there, but there was this crowd of people in the audience that were just as amazing as this band. You know, there was Sid there, and there was the Bromley lot, and various other people, and they looked like cartoon superheroes to me, mutant X-Men type thing, but long before X-Men. But that kind of feeling that this was kind of somehow a mutant gene that was attracting these people together, and they didn't care what anyone thought of the music. In fact, they liked it that people didn't like it, you know. So there was a sense of theatre in the room, which you just didn't get in rock and roll at that point. You know, I used to go and see lots of gigs. I saw crazy gigs, you know, Led Zeppelin in the pub above, the room above Kloop's Cleek pub in, you know, which was pretty amazing, I guess. You couldn't hear anything for a week afterwards because it was so small and so loud. But it was always a kind of adoring audience and a rock band on the stage, whereas this was like a Marquis de Sade play in the asylum, you know, Charenton. It was fantastic to see. The band started falling apart after the real high tide of, you know, the high watermark of God Save the Queen and the Jubilee, and the fact they abolished the number one position in honour of the Sex Pistols was pretty great. And in a way, it's very hard to top that. On one level, there was also the violence, very real violence of people really, John particularly, getting really badly attacked and stabbed and stuff. When Nancy arrived, she tried to sleep with John, and that wasn't on. She made a beeline for Sid, and she really brought a lot of rock and roll habits and attitudes from New York City. You know, she was from like Bad Company and people like that, which she'd been hanging out with before. So all this kind of the cliches of rock and roll, the leather jackets and the drugs and the kind of the latter punk kind of uniform and way of thinking and so on, came into the Sex Pistols camp with Nancy, and that ruined it to an extent. And then the fact that Sid became so savagely addicted to heroin. He's obviously the kind of person that it really sinks its jaws into. I mean, some people can play around with it and not get that caught by it, but he really began to lose it quite quickly in that autumn. So all those factors, plus the fact the film had fallen through, were, it was kind of what can we do? And we had all this footage, stuff that I'd filmed, stuff we'd got from TV. You know, there was a massive stuff, so there was a sense of trying to do a more documentary thing, more in the London world that it came from. And then during that autumn, we spent time together in Marble Arch, where I was living. Quite often Malcolm would come by in the evening and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours sketching out these ideas for it. Very Godard inspired. The idea of these 10 lessons was Malcolm's idea. Malcolm was a huge part of writing this film. Sometimes his language wasn't as, because I'd been to Cambridge and all this stuff, I could write things perhaps more easily, but a lot of the ideas were his. But it was very much bouncing off, and I was deep involved in film theory and studies and so on, so I was bringing, elements of that to it. But it was really this idea that only took place after the band split, really. they went off. I remember this gig in Huddersfield on Christmas Day, which was a very strange time to have a gig. We all went up to Huddersfield where the firemen were on strike, and that was the last gig they played in England. And it was beautiful because they were very close, and it seemed that despite all this thing that had been brewing, that they were still very much a band. And I think they were quite optimistic, the band, when they went to America. I do feel that Malcolm had the idea of he was going to wreck it in America. The band know more about the politics of that than I do, but my sense of it was there was a kind of trap waiting at the end of this tour. There was also the thing of Branson and Virgin courting John as well, the other way. While Sid was Malcolm was undermining him, Branson was saying, "You're the star." The others are there was an element of that. So, that was my reading of it anyway. And I always felt in the middle, because I did very much admire, Malcolm's take. He's the whole situation, this madness that he brought to things, the grandeur, the folly of his vision.
The humour as well.
Yeah, great humour. But not enough about himself, maybe. So, there was more humour then than there has been since. But yeah, the whole thing was a great laugh, for a while, and then it was sad to see it sour and so on. But anyway, when the tour was over, there was no band, and it was like, how do we make sense of this now? And the idea was to create this very stylized, very what would the word be? Polemic film about what, in a sense, Sex Pistols meant. So it wasn't a kind of documentary about the boys in the band, very much not. And we couldn't have John, because by that stage it was, we could only use John as we'd filmed him already, because he's, he completely, but the relationship with Malcolm had gone completely, which was always going to be a huge hole in whatever film about the Sex Pistols if you can't involve John. On the other hand, we had great stuff of John being the singer of the Sex Pistols, and speaking and doing lots of things that was such a huge part of the band, not just the stage performance, the attitude and the intelligence and the take on everything. He was a great teacher to that generation of kids at that time, and he burnt with this incandescent righteousness that was very, very powerful. And there was a deep honesty about the guy, and all that gets, in that kind of success and the storm of it, all that gets muddied up, and ego things come in and so on. But there was something so special about John that the film would have been a much greater thing if he'd been part of it, I think. But we were working without that, and we were also working in the context of seeing the Pistols become the poster on the bedroom wall of the day, where you kneel down and last thing at night and pray to your rock god, and that was never the point of the Sex Pistols. We certainly felt very strongly that the myth had to be dynamited in some way. We had to make this film in a way to enrage the fans, not make a film to butter up the legend or polish the armour or whatever of the Sex Pistols. We ended up in this fantastic cutting room above who's a kind of laundromat king of Soho. He's a real Rackman figure, in this cutting room that had a hole in the roof, so it was snowing actually while we were editing, which was kind of great. And these bits of film, it had been done in such a mad, anarchic kind of way. There were little bits with bits written on, and Malcolm, fired me, saying, you're a middle-class bastard, and I brought you out of the gutter, which is a weird thing to say. And I've spoken to your teachers, and they tell me you're a piece of shit. And it was a complete surprise to me, because I put 3 years of my life into this, really enjoying every minute of it, but really committed to it as a work of a creative act, and to be told I was fired, but he wanted me to work as a slave in the cutting room, because I was the only one who knew where things were.
I mean, it's been suggested that in fact Malcolm was actually always far more interested in making a film about the Sex Pistols than their records, really. What do you think?
you know, you could say he was far more interested in being a front man performer himself than managing a band. There are lots of things you could say about Malcolm, and probably all of them have a bit of truth. I think he was genuinely excited about the potential as it evolved of this band, and managing it was a fantastic thing for him at the beginning. But as it, you know, became a national, international thing, obviously his horizons widened, and you know, there is this great tradition of movies about pop bands that are usually terrible, but in their horribleness they have a kind of interesting charm. You know, one of my favourites is the Dave Clark 5 movie, actually.
John Borman's
Catch Us
first
If You
film.
Can, you know, which is this magical snowy winter in Bath. So you've got the black and white, it's in black and white, and you've got, you know, Bath, all the buildings still black, they haven't been scrubbed, and everything else is snow. So there's this set of this thing with these silly Hard Day's Night type running around Bath, but it's got a grandeur and a power, and the guy learned how to make his films, you know, partly by doing that. And in Born to Boogie, and the T-Rex movie, and the Slade movie is actually quite a good movie. So there was always, you know, let's make a film. If the band is the biggest thing, you should make a film. It wasn't just Malcolm, I want to make films. That was the kind of expected thing, you know. The Stones had done it, and Ziggy Stardust, the Beatles had obviously started the whole thing. So, you know, it was an expected thing to do, as well as Malcolm perhaps having ambitions to be a film producer or whatever. You know, to be told I was fired, but he wanted me to work as a slave in the cutting room, because I was the only one who knew where things were. Slave in the cutting room was
that his phrase?
Yeah. And I wasn't to talk. I was just to fetch, like step and fetch it. It was very, you know, there's a pattern. I think other people have experienced it. I was aware that, you know, we were telling one side of the story in some ways because we'd had this conceit of the mad Machiavellian manager and pumping that for all it was. That the band needed, you know, there needed to be a perspective on Malcolm in there. If he's behaving like this to the band and to everyone involved, it would be good to hang in there and try and make it a bit about this megalomaniac for real, you know.
So he's coming to believe in his own myth, presumably, at that point.
Well, I think he was. I mean, I think he was freaking out, you know, because Nancy was dead, Sid was dead. You know, it was a nightmare time, you know, so I understand the guy was...
So he's having a bit of a breakdown, in fact.
Having a bit of a breakdown, I think. It became a thing of whether, you know, I would hang in there and finish the film, or whether Malcolm would get me out, and I really made a point to hang in there, and then he took his name off it, so I finished it. I certainly wouldn't want to sit here and say that Malcolm had nothing to do with this film. He was a huge, huge part of it, but so were the band, so was the energy of the time, so were the guys who did the animation. You know, there were so many things going into this movie, but I think it is a document of its time more than anything else, you know, and it's certainly was a good thing for me to have the chance to kind of redress the balance and make a different kind of film, a more human film about the Sex Pistols, which is called The Filth and the Fury. And I quite like the idea that you can be mad enough to take the same subject and make a film a completely different way.
So who killed Bambi?
Who killed Bambi? I think we all did.